Perfect. All right, it's recording. This is Thelma Alanis interviewing Brian East for the UT Arlington, Texas Disability History Oral History Project. Today's date is March 28, 2022, and this interview is being conducted via Microsoft Teams. I am here today to talk with Brian East about disability rights and disability discrimination. Brian East is a senior attorney in the Disability Rights Texas, a nonprofit corporation advocating for the rights of people with disabilities. He is also a graduate from the University of Texas School of Law in 1977. Good afternoon, Brian. And before I begin the interview, I want to formally thank you for participating in our university's oral history project.
Oh, well, you're welcome. And how are you?
Good, thank you. So let's see, where do I begin? Based on the resume, all I can say is that you have an outstanding resume. I mean, I can see why Texas Magazine has given you the title of super lawyer. You have served in a lot of subcommittees and committees. You are also the co-author and editor of the chapter of Workers with Disabilities in the Employee Union Guide to Labor Law. But I guess let's just start from the beginning. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself? How was your childhood and your family?
Yes. So my father was a career Air Force officer. We moved around a lot. No one in my immediate family had a disability, or at least not that I was aware of. I ended up graduating from high school in Montgomery, Alabama in the 60s, which was a pretty formative time, and then went to college in the 70s during the Vietnam War, which also had a big impact on me. And I started out in college planning to be an engineer and went to an engineering school, but later decided that that isn't what I wanted to do, and I was more interested in social sciences. So I transferred to UT Austin, graduated with a bachelor's degree in sociology, took a year off to travel, and then went to law school at UT.
Okay, so what inspired you to pursue law and attend law school? Can you recall like your aha moment when you knew that law school was your calling?
Sort of. So I never thought of law school or being a lawyer growing up. I didn't really know anybody that did that. I had some more distant relatives that I had not met that had been lawyers, but I never really thought about it. I didn't think about it in college either, and didn't even think about it when I was graduating. And in the year that I took off, several things were happening around that time, including the Watergate hearings. And of course, that had a lot to do with law, and almost everybody involved in that was a lawyer, for good or ill. And so that got me thinking about the possibility of law school and whether it would be a way to sort of work for social justice and make things better, whether I could be a lawyer, not like the ones I was watching on TV, but something different. And so it was kind of a last minute thing, a last minute decision. I was working a clerical job before I was going to go to grad school, and got interested and decided to apply and got accepted. And yeah, that was about it.
So based on the research that I was able to inquire, I saw that you graduated from the University of Texas of Law in 1977, and then you began private practice in Austin in 1982. And then since 1989, you concentrated in employment and civil rights law. the gap in between, I guess before the private practice.
Yeah.
Do you mind?
Yeah, so I can fill in that gap. So my between my second and third year of law school, I had a summer clerkship at the legal aid program on the Navajo Indian Reservation, and was really taken by the work and the people. And so I applied to work there when I graduated and got hired at that program and worked for 2 years in legal aid there. Um, and then for personal reasons related to my then partner's child, um, we moved to Boston. And I took the bar there and got licensed. But sort of before I could decide what I wanted to do with that license, um, an opportunity came uh, for us to move back to Austin. And so I did that. And at that time, I was not licensed in Texas. I had been licensed in Arizona, licensed in Massachusetts. So when I came back, I didn't rush to take the bar in Texas. And instead, I worked as a law clerk or paralegal for a couple of different firms, one doing principally immigration, and the other doing general practice with sort of a focus on criminal law, criminal defense law. And so I did that for a while, and they both encouraged me to take the bar and become a lawyer in Texas, which I did. And then I ended up working for one of those practices for several years before going out on my own with a couple of friends doing employment and civil rights.
It's really impressive. Okay, so let's see. So before, I guess once you decided to go to law school and you were in law school, did you ever imagine yourself being an advocate for people's right for, sorry, an advocate for rights of people with disability, or was that something that eventually just sparked your interest with internships that you were doing in there, or did that just kind of come about eventually in your career?
Um, I didn't have a particular focus or thought about focusing on disability rights when I was in law school. I was very focused on doing civil rights and poverty law and social justice work. But I didn't have a clear picture of where I would end up or how I would be doing it or what I would be doing. There were no disability rights courses that I recall in law school. There were other classes that touched on those rights. Constitutional law touched on the rights of people with disabilities to some extent. Although when I went to law school was before many important cases had been decided. I took an education class and they talked about special education services under the precursor to law to the one we have now. So I had a little bit of exposure, but wasn't particularly focused on it. And really that happened after I started doing employment and civil rights work. And almost at the same time, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. So I started doing that work in 1989. That law was passed in 1990. And I still remember, in fact, I still have the little newsletter we would get in the mail announcing new legislative changes. And there was this whole little booklet on this Americans with Disabilities Act that I knew, I'd heard of it, but I knew very little about it. And I remember reading it and trying to digest it. And then fairly quickly after that, I got a disability discrimination case and tried that. And I think it was the first first ADA trial in the country that wasn't done by the EEOC. I think they had done one government case before this one, but I think it was the first private one. And there was some local publicity, and so people started coming to me with other disability cases. So I didn't take it because I wanted to change to that focus. And at the time, I was taking sex discrimination cases, race discrimination cases, age discrimination cases, jail conditions cases, just various things. But it kind of snowballed, I guess, because of publicity and taking more cases and getting more publicity. And so I started to focus on it more and more. And eventually, in the mid-90s, began working first as a contract lawyer for Disability Rights Texas, which at the time was called Advocacy Incorporated. And that was exclusively disability rights. So that happened in about 1994, where I was working for them part-time on a contract. By 1995, I was working for them full-time and doing nothing but disability rights.
Wow. So I know that you have handled several disability discrimination and disability rights cases in the state and federal court. Can you think of maybe one of those cases that are, I guess, one of the most memorable of one of those cases that you can think of? And maybe what was your motivation throughout those cases when you were experiencing any of those cases?
Yeah, well, my motivation was to help my client and to help advance the law, advance the rights of people with disabilities. So particularly in those early days, the first 10 years or so, the law was not developed. So, everybody doing work in this area was helping to develop the law. And as it turned out, fighting an uphill battle against the courts, which has been recalibrated a little bit. But I don't recall any particular case exactly. I recall representing an individual who was having trouble getting the services that he wanted in public school. And he was deaf and blind. And that was a very interesting experience for me because we used an interpreter, of course, but the interpreter had to interpret into his hands. So he would sort of drape his hands over the interpreter who was using sign language and read the signs that way. And the communication was actually quite good, when we had a proficient sign language interpreter or a team of them, which we did. Was also pretty draining for the interpreter because it was sort of hard on the hands and arms to, sort of be supporting the hands and arms of my client. And also, signing all the conversation. But it was really a good experience, and it started having personal relationships with people with disabilities, and that was sort of interesting and eye-opening and a growth experience for me. And at the time, there were one of the big issues was whether the ADA prohibited unnecessary segregation. And so at that time, still true today, but even worse then, at that time, most state services for people with disabilities were provided in a segregated institutional setting and only there. And it was very hard, if not impossible, to have those same support services provided to you in your own home in the community. And so there was a really important case that went up to the US Supreme Court. I did not work on it, but I remember going to demonstrations in Washington, D.C. During the week it was argued in front of the Supreme Court, hearing really wonderful disability rights advocates and speakers and people that had worked on the ADA presenting, going to legislators and talking to them about things, and going with clients and other community members that had disabilities, getting a chance to talk to them. So that was really formative. I later was able to write a brief to the US Supreme Court in a case that came out generally pretty positively, not completely, but generally pretty good. And then was able to contribute to the ADA Amendments Act of 2008, where the Congress told the courts that they had been getting the definition of disability all wrong, and they changed the law so that it would be corrected. And there was an opportunity to talk to the people who were negotiating the language around that change. And so that was valuable.
That's amazing. Do you let's see. So I've seen that, well, when I was looking at your resume, I also saw that you have served in a variety of different legal boards. Can you explain what exactly does it mean to serve on a legal board?
Yeah, so I think the first one I served on may have been the legal committee of AIDS Services of Austin. So this would have been in the 80s, or this would have been in the late 80s or early 90s. I'm not exactly sure. But at that time, AIDS Services of Austin was sort of the umbrella group, may still be, but ASA was a group that coordinated a lot of services and a lot of advocacy work for people in the midst of that, of the HIV epidemic, which at the time was, was 100% fatal, or virtually 100% fatal. And so there was a lot of work that needed to be done to help people write wills, to help people who had been discriminated against at work, to help people get access to services. And there was a group of lawyers that volunteered their time to take cases, but also provide legal support to the work that the AIDS Services of Austin was doing. So that was, I met great people, and it was really rewarding. But each of the committees I've served on does something a little different. I was on the legal advocacy subcommittee of the American Diabetes Association, and there we were trying to sort of bridge the gap between a traditional health-oriented advocacy organization, sort of a organization working for cure and working for treatments and that kind of thing, but also recognizing that there was a lot of discrimination happening against people with particular conditions. And so we were trying to sort of bring together the medical people who understood all that and the legal people who understood the law, and figure out how we could work together to help people who had been discriminated against on the basis of diabetes. And then there was a board of the Texas Employment Lawyers Association and a board of the National Employment Lawyers Association, and I've served on both of those. And that just helps direct those programs, both of which are a collection or a group of plaintiff side employment lawyers. So representing individual employees who've been discriminated against, and other kinds of claims, not just discrimination, could be wage and hour violations or various other things. So each of the committees I've served on has been a little bit different. The organization I belong to, Disability Rights Texas, that I work for, we have an umbrella group. So we refer to ourselves as the P&A, the Protection and Advocacy System for Texas. Every state has one, has a P&A. And we have an umbrella organization, which is called the National Disability Rights Network, NDRN. And that group also has a legal committee that provides input to the work they do, sort of coming up with training around various disability rights topics, considering and reviewing or drafting friend of the court briefs on disability topics. So all of those opportunities have been really rewarding for me, helped me, meet some really great lawyers, and sort of exposed me to different ideas for how advocacy can be accomplished.
Wow. Yeah, no, it sounds very wow. Can you remember, I guess, an experience that you had, I guess, in with the client in one of your, I guess, in one of the board when you were helping someone, maybe in the AIDS board as well, or anything?
Well, yes, I can remember representing actually, that first trial that I mentioned was on behalf of an individual with HIV disease. And she had been discriminated against at work. And so that was what that case was about. And it was difficult, and it was early days, and there was a lot of fear around AIDS at the time. There was no effective treatment. She was somebody who was understudy because although she had the disease, it didn't seem to be progressing in her the way it did in almost everybody else. So she was the subject of scientific study, but she was also discriminated against. And I can remember other clients like that. I remember another individual who was discriminated against, and by the time his case his case was getting ready to be filed, he was quite ill. So he had not been that ill when he was discriminated against, but by the time we got to court, he was. And he knew that he was not going to survive the litigation. So he was just a very thoughtful, strong person, and he planned it all out. He, had a will written for who he wanted any benefit from the lawsuit to go to. He named his parents as the executor of his estate. We took his deposition at the very beginning because we were not sure that he would be there later on, and he did die during the litigation. We ended up settling it, and at that point, my clients were the parents, and the money went to who he wanted it to go to, who were minor children. They were a nephew and a niece of his. So all that was just seeing somebody with a really severe disability, somebody who knew they were going to, die before too long, but, just determined to see things right, was a valuable experience. But I can remember other cases where it was all about just going to the hospital with the paperwork needed to do wills. And it was, making sure the doctor was there and the doctor could testify that at this moment, the person was mentally competent, and therefore he could document that in the file, or she could document that in the file. And we could get the client's will and other estate planning documents done. So it wasn't necessarily unusual stuff, but it was, in a situation where you're not, normally it's in a law office and, you're scheduling it a few weeks ahead, and it's more of a leisurely process. And, in those days it wasn't. So.
It sounds very emotionally draining, but it also rewarding. But I can't imagine doing that. That puts a lot in perspective. I also, when I was reading your resume, I saw that you have earned a lot of awards as well. It says here that you got award 2003, the Excellent in Public Interest Award from the Texas Law Fellowships, 2008 Martha Arbuckle Award. Like, there's a variety of awards are just listed. From August, how did you feel receiving such awards? Did you feel that it complemented your work? Does it motivate you to continue doing the work that you do?
I don't think it motivates me because I'm happy to do the work, whether I get awards or not, or recognition or not. But I think it is always good to be recognized. I remember that the Arbuckle Award from the Mayor's Committee for Disabilities at City of Austin. My mother came to that event, so she was alive at that time, and she was in a wheelchair. So that was, I don't even know how much she was aware of exactly what I did day to day. But I think she was proud of me, and it was, I never thought of myself as having people with disabilities in my immediate family, but there she was in a wheelchair, and And it's good. I think, one of the awards was from the state bar. And I think for the state bar, the state bar, a lot of people in the state bar don't even know what our program does or don't know it exists. And so getting the word out that it exists, that there is this disability rights organization, is an important thing. And the award from the governor's committee actually named, in honor of somebody who is really much more central to disability rights than I've ever been or ever will be. But that was good, and it allowed me, or it sort of reinforced ties that I had with the governor's committee, and they do a lot of good work for people with disabilities in Texas, and many states have a governor's committee on people with disabilities, but Texas does, and they have a lot of resources available for people and research available. So it was good to get that award and to be recognized, but also just to confirm my relationships with those folks, because they've been doing great work for decades.
Can you share your experience as a co-author and editor on the Workers with Disability in the Employee and Union Member Guide to Labor Law?
Yes, so I was approached, I don't remember how it happened, but a lawyer in an organization that I was a member of reached out and said, "Hey, let's have a beer when you're at the convention in Portland, because I have this project I want to talk to you about." And it turned out that she was the editor, the overall editor of this treatise, a 3-volume treatise on employment rights. And there was a chapter on disability, but it was very dated, and it didn't really have much in there about modern disability rights law. And so I agreed to do it with my then law partner and a couple of other lawyers from around the country. And so we all did it that first year, and pretty much everybody moved on to other things, and I kept doing it. So that would have been, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. It was a long time ago when I started doing that. And I've been doing it at least every year. Now I'm doing it twice a year, just sort of updating it and just keeping it current, and keeping the resources in one place for people like me who have an employment discrimination case on behalf of an individual with disabilities and wants to know what the law is around something, what the main cases are, saying various things. So trying to collect those resources and keep them up to date. So that's been really valuable. It's valuable to me. I use it myself because I don't remember, thousands of cases, and I read a lot of them, but I don't remember them. And so this, sort of putting them in one place allows me to, I just have to remember that there's a section that talks about this. I don't have to remember what the cases are, because then I can go to that section and see the cases. So that's been, really valuable to me, and I think it's valuable to other people. And it also allows me to, many years ago, I guess now, maybe, I don't know how long ago, 20 years ago, maybe, the then executive director for the organization I work for now came to me and was talking about, my work and what I was doing. And he was saying that that the organizations, the P&As, the organizations that we work for, a lot of the funding is federal, and a lot of it is sort of based on population counts. And so that meant that California and Texas and maybe New York had a lot more money and a lot more people than, the P&A in Mississippi or, other places, because there were so many more people in Texas, and therefore the funding was higher. And so he was challenging me to be a support person to other people, not even within the organization, not just within the organization. Because a lot of what I do is supporting the work of other lawyers in the organization around ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act issues. But he was challenging me to provide that support to other people that didn't have the resources that we had. And so ever since then, that is one of the things I do is I'm a resource, or I want to be a resource. I try to be a resource to other lawyers, lawyers at other P&As, but private lawyers too, or government lawyers, any lawyers that are representing individuals with disabilities and need some ideas around something, need some case citations, or just want to talk about strategy. And there are several people that serve this role for me and for others too, but that is one of the things I do. So that chapter sort of keeps me focused on what the law is and where we are, and helps me to advise others.
So when I was looking at your resume, one of the things that I also came across was your written testimony on the disability rights, well, in Disability Rights Texas, but it's pertaining to COVID-19, that you're, the pandemic that's going on. So I would love to hear what's your perspective on the COVID-19 pandemic when it's pertaining to, of course, disability, and if you can elaborate on the matter that you're working on.
Yeah, so lots of people have said a lot of things about the pandemic, and it's been the topic of lots of thinking and writing, and people can say things better than I can. The obvious points I will make is that the pandemic, as hard as it's been on everybody, has been harder on people with disabilities because most of the risk factors for a serious or fatal case of COVID-19 are disabilities. So there are certainly disabilities that don't change your risk. But when you look at the risks, the things that do change your risk, there are a few things like smoking that are not a disability, age that's not a disability. But after those, almost everything is a disability. And so when you're looking at who died in the pandemic, who is at risk, just really hitting people with disabilities harder. And so all the things that made the pandemic difficult are, sort of exaggerated, I would say. And also the sort of political fight around the pandemic or pandemic relief ideas are more frustrating because people who are young and healthy may validly for themselves see their risk as pretty low, but unless they are never around people with disabilities, that risk is not just theirs. They may be spreading it, never even know they're spreading it, never even have symptoms themselves. So it's been difficult. Then there were some, sort of really bad things that happened in the early days. So one of the things that happened nationwide, here and there, was particularly when things were really bad, when the ICUs were full, when the ventilators were all in use and everybody was trying to find more, when there was no effective treatment, much less a vaccine, there were emergency guidelines in some places that seemed to judge whether to treat somebody with heroic measures like putting them on a vent as something that should be based on an assessment of the quality of their life. And therefore, if they had a significant disability, then the people might have seen them as less worthy, and therefore they would be not at the top of the list to get the next ventilator. And I think in some ways that was a holdover from earlier bad thinking, but now we were all in the crucible, and we were all seeing, the real world consequences of these things that we hadn't had to deal with, and now we did. And so there was a big pushback by our program, by other programs around the country, and also even at that time it was the Trump administration, and even that administration. No, I don't say even that administration, but that administration realized that sort of judgment about whether a person's life is worth saving was not what they wanted to support. And so that challenges were generally successful on that. There were other things that were lesser problems, but still big problems. So it made sense for hospitals to have a no visitor rule during the worst of this. And therefore, people would normally come in with their parent or their spouse when they were ill and stay with them, and that couldn't be done. And again, that made sense in a lot of circumstances, but there were other people who could only communicate by having someone with them, or could only access the services, could only understand the services by having someone with them. And it took a while for the healthcare providers to realize that there's this general rule about no visitors or whatever, and that makes sense, and we're going to stick to it. But we have to have a mechanism for exceptions when the disability demands it. So there was a lot of things working through things in the sort of healthcare arena, but as you might suspect, there was also a lot of disability discrimination in the workplace. What we expected most of that would be, and what I think most of that has been so far, is somebody who is worried about getting COVID-19 because they have one of these identified risk factors, type 2 diabetes or cystic fibrosis or severe asthma or something like that. And they know that if they get COVID-19, the odds of it being very serious are much greater. And so they are asking for accommodations at work, not because they can't do the work, not because they have COVID-19, but because they're trying to avoid getting COVID-19. So they were often asking to work from home remotely. So, there was sort of this forced social experiment in the spring and summer of 2020, where millions of people that did not work from home and never thought about working from home, some of them didn't want to work from home, but were all forced to work from home. But as that started, and obviously there were a lot of jobs that couldn't be done at a distance, but there were a lot that could. But typically beginning in the summer of 2020, there was a move to reopen and a move to have people come back to the office. And so there were people that were saying, I've done my job well for the last several months. Let me keep doing it, at least until there's a vaccine. And that has been a big fight for a lot of individuals. So over the months since spring of 2020, we've been writing informational handouts to individuals, putting them on our website, doing presentations to individuals and to lawyers about the kinds of claims that might exist, the kinds of accommodations that might be appropriate, and taking cases and giving individual advice. So it's been especially I'd say for the first year, a very active time when a lot of our work was COVID-19 related.
No, yeah, absolutely. It's crazy. So as you probably know, since you work in the field, and you're dealing a lot with COVID cases, I guess the term they're using is a long COVID.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of cases, I don't know if you're able to talk about it, have you dealt with that, and what verdict has there been? I know I've heard different things that are being done in the EU, but I don't know what exactly they're doing here in the United States.
Yeah, so one question that this kind of raises is COVID-19 itself a disability? So if I'm able-bodied, don't have a current disability, but I acquire COVID-19, do I now have a disability? And for quite a while, the main policy writing organizations, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for Employment Law and the Department of Justice for other kinds of ADA law, did not weigh in on that question. So they have now weighed in, and to synopsize it, I think what they say is if you have a very minor case that goes away and don't have much symptoms and no long-term symptoms, then may not be a disability, or may not be an actual disability anyway. On the other hand, if you either had a really severe case, maybe it's completely gone now, but you were in the ICU and, for weeks, that may be a disability, may have been a disability. And if you have long COVID, that could be a disability. The problem is that not that I'm especially up on the medical side, but from what I gather, there is no clear definition of long COVID. It's sort of a descriptive term for something that's happening, but it's not like you can do, a finger stick and get a sample of blood and look at it and say, oh, you have long COVID. Some people have COVID and have symptoms for a long time, and some people don't. And some people don't think they do, but actually they do when when you're inquire about various things. So that makes a difference because, so before I was describing the situation of someone who has not needed an accommodation before, but now they need it not because they have COVID, but because they have a risk of getting a severe case of COVID. But the other question is, what about accommodations that work for someone who has COVID? So we've talked to a lot of people who got COVID-19, reported it to their boss, said that their doctor told them to isolate for 10 days, so they were going to take 10 days off, and then got fired. Well, there's nothing that we can do in the disability arena under the ADA unless COVID itself is a disability, because they're being fired for having it. And so those cases, I would say generally all of these cases are just now starting to hit the courts. Well, that's not the right way to say it. We're just now starting to get written opinions about them. And the reason is, for employment discrimination, you first have to go through an administrative exhaustion, and that can take months. And so after that, then you have to file a lawsuit. And then there's a period of time when the lawsuit is sort of, things are happening behind the scenes. And then typically there's some sort of motion and the judge has to decide, is this a disability? Is this a reasonable accommodation? Those are only just now starting to happen. So we don't know for sure what the weight of authority or what the legal tide is going to look like yet, because there's only been 3 or 4 cases that have gone to this sort of formal opinion, and there'll be lots more. They're in the pipeline. They just haven't gotten to an opinion yet. So it is hard to predict exactly how supportive of the rights of people with disabilities in the pandemic the courts will be. And we can tell that the employers have been a mixed bag. Some have been very flexible and doing what needs to be done, and some have been very rigid. And that isn't the way we do it here, so you can't do that, and forcing people out. So we'll just see what happens.
No, absolutely. I mean, I work in an airline industry, and as you probably know, so the CDC says you should isolate for 10 days, but because they were able to lobby, now they reduced it to 5 days, but you're still contagious for 10. So even though you're still contagious for 10, you are able to come and work as long as you wear a mask, but apparently you can still be contagious. So if you do come to work, I mean, if you refuse to go to work, you're not going to get paid for the other 5 days, and it will count against you. So but I mean, you try not to go to work. I remember when I got COVID earlier this year, I lost so many people at work because of COVID. A lot of people, we all got COVID, and a lot of people during 2020 passed away, a lot. So because we have a lot of people there who I know are in risk, when I got COVID in January, I was like, I'm not gonna go there knowing that I could potentially give it to someone, because I don't want to be that person. And truth be told, here you are, you're not gonna get paid for 5 days. I'm like, well, it is what it is. I guess I won't get paid for 5 days, but I'll take it.
Right. So that's wrong, that employers treat people like that. But and the early pandemic relief laws helped on that score because they built in some leave rights and some unemployment enhancements and that kind of thing. But that, that's not good. And then there are people that were fired instead of just docked the pay. So it has been challenging, which is not to say that the employers had an easy go of it. They were juggling a lot of factors themselves, but I think they tended to have a one size fits all, like everybody work remotely now. Now everybody come back, and not perhaps be as flexible as the law intends that they be.
So let's see. So what advice would you have for someone who might want to follow your footsteps?
Okay, so if we're talking about a career in the law, my sort of earliest stage advice is to have, and not everybody would agree with me, but my pitch is create as little debt as possible going to law school. And so if you got accepted at a very good law school in state where the tuition is X, and you also got accepted at a famous law school that's private and the tuition is 3 times that, seriously consider, if you can't afford to pay out of pocket, which a lot of people cannot, most people cannot, then seriously consider your judgment about where you're going to go. Because if what you want to do is be, a judge or a federal law clerk to a judge, or a law professor, then where you go to school can make a difference. But if what you want to do is be a good lawyer, there's a lot of schools that can prepare you to do that. And if you come out of school with a $200,000 debt, which is, sort of a figure I hear, then you may be limited in what you can do. So there are now loan repayment programs that sort of repay or make payments on the debt for you if you're doing public interest work. There are various sort of ways to deal with it, but I do think it is hard to do the kind of work I'm doing, which will not be highly paid if you have this huge debt that you have to pay off. So that's one thing. The other thing I would think of, the other things that occur to me are to, take the, courses that are about civil rights in law school. And so a lot of the curriculum is fixed, but some of it are electives that you can choose. Think about taking clinical or being part of a clinical program, or taking a seminar where there's a clinical piece where you're actually representing individuals. And it could be doing a million different things. Could be writing supportive decision-making agreements for people who have a person who's becoming an adult and has a disability and doesn't want a formal guardianship and all the loss of civil rights that entails. Or it could be representing individuals in courtroom. It could be a lot of different things. So I think those are valuable. And then, see if you can afford to take a job at a legal services corporation funded program, or in the P&A network, or some of the other disability rights resources that are, just so great. The lawyers are great. They've been great for a long time. If you have an opportunity to be around them, it will be a really wonderful experience. Like the Center for um, the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law, just for example, CPR in Massachusetts, um, the National Health Law Project. There's lots of really great programs that do really important work for people with disabilities, and are, are have lawyers with disabilities on their staff, and that is a really, any experience you can have working with those folks is great. So those are the things that I think of. It, the way I've done it is not, it's not something you can get rich at. And so if that's important to you, it's hard to have both those things. But it is possible to, have a decent income, and do that kind of work.
So what advice do you also have for students to, I guess, for law school and I guess passing the bar? Because you passed the bar, it looks like multiple times. So what advice do you have for that as well?
Well, I studied pretty hard in law school, but I was not a great student. And in part, that was because I was also working as a law clerk for various entities. And I found that more exciting than classroom work. So that's not necessarily, well, that isn't the best way to do it. So I think, typically there are people that go to law school that have never had to work very hard because they're really smart. And you can get by in most law schools without having to work super hard. But I think the rewards for working really hard and getting good grades are important. So I think, it is a time when you, even if it's not fun, for me it was fun, but if for some people it's not, and it's typically a 3-year program. I was in an accelerated class at University of Texas Law School, so it was 2.5 years. And so, it's not too long to work hard. I think taking a bar review class is worth it. So you pay a bunch of money and they have teachers that lecture to you on the courses that will be on the bar, and they give you sample questions from the past things. And if you don't pass the bar, you can retake the prep course for free. I think that's valuable. Setting aside time to, take it seriously and study for it is good. I would also especially encourage people with disabilities to consider going into law. There are not enough people with disabilities, and we, the bar, uh, in general, but also the disability rights bar in particular, would be, greatly informed and improved if there were more lawyers who are deaf, who are blind, who use wheelchairs, who have have autism spectrum disorder, or have another serious mental illness. Those things inform so much of, your life if you have them, and are so informative to those around you. And, it's just an opportunity for those of us who have um, hidden discriminatory views to realize that, that's what we've been doing in our head all these years, thinking, just, having this sort of implicit bias against certain kinds of disabilities, and realizing what a mistake that is when we are working alongside somebody with a disability who is way more brilliant, way more skilled, way more just a stronger advocate than we are. It's just, it it's important for all of us. It's important for the movement. It's important. I think it's a great career for individuals, but it's, important for everybody.
Absolutely. I guess before we conclude the interview, is there anything that you wanted to share or touch on that you feel that we didn't touch on today?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think we've all come a long way. I think the ADA has helped us, but there's a lot left to do. When I I can remember when I was, a young lawyer. So in the late 70s and early 80s, there were no curb ramps. There were, it was just, you didn't see too many people with wheelchairs out and about. Didn't see sign language interpreters except only rarely. And now it's much more common to see, some news event with an interpreter there, to go to the Dairy Queen and have a wheelchair ramp. It would come a long way, but it just when someone comes to us and says, I think there's accessibility problems at business A, I can almost guarantee you there are accessibility problems at business A. I haven't seen it yet, and I can go and look, and they may not, and there may be some basic things that are done right, but we just still have a long way to go. Businesses that are not at all accessible, businesses that are only partially accessible. Now in this, sort of modern world online, websites that are accessible and many that are not. We just have to keep working. It's a constant. You just have to be constantly thinking about everything we do and are we making it universally accessible.
I'm so glad we have people like you.
Well, thank you. Back at you, and I enjoyed the interview.
Me as well. Let me end the recording, right? Stop recording.